Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're stepping into what is easily one of the most mysterious and misunderstood traditions in all of human history, the 72 demons of King Solomon. Now, right off the bat, I want to be super clear, what we're exploring today is absolutely not a manual of spellcraft or magic. Instead, we're looking at a deeply fascinating history of texts, of human belief, and of how ancient societies tried to impose some kind of structure onto the terrifying chaos of their world through lists, names, and symbols. We're going to look at how humans throughout centuries have tried to give a tangible shape to the things that terrify them the most.
It's a pretty compelling mystery, isn't it? I mean, just think about it for a second. How exactly did a king who is traditionally famous for his wisdom, his justice, and his diplomacy somehow become history's most legendary commander of demons? Okay, let's dive into this and unravel exactly how this incredible transformation happened.
So, part one, two versions of Solomon. We're looking at the biblical versus the legendary.
You know, history has actually handed us two completely different versions of King Solomon, and over time, they just sort of blurred together. First up, we have the biblical Solomon. In the Hebrew Bible, he is the ultimate ideal ruler. His wisdom is deeply practical. He's focused on justice, diplomacy, administration, and building the great temple. He brings order to his kingdom through sheer insight, not magic. But by contrast, we have the legendary Solomon. This figure emerges much later on, complete with a magic ring, powerful sigils, and the ability to literally command invisible forces. Why? Because when subsequent generations faced massive instability, unexplainable illness, or chaos that normal law and reason just couldn't fix, they essentially borrowed Solomon's authority. They created a legendary figure who could manage the invisible, terrifying worlds they couldn't control.
Let's move to and see how this builds across our timeline. The evolution of this myth takes us on a massive chronological journey. We start with the Bible's foundations of wisdom and justice. Then, skipping ahead to late antiquity, we see the emergence of a text called the Testament of Solomon. From there, we move into the rabbinic era with stories from the Talmud, jump all the way to the 16th century with a physician named Johann Weyer, and finally, we arrive in the 17th century with the famous occult text, the Ars Goetia. All right, part two, the Testament and the Talmud. Let's head into the late antiquity era. As we transition into late antiquity, which is where this legendary myth really started to take its distinct shape, our very first stop is the Testament of Solomon. And when we look at this text, the definition of a demon is actually pretty fascinating. We aren't talking about purely evil theological monsters here. You have to remember, this was a pre-scientific world. Without modern medicine or psychology, humans personified their invisible fears and sufferings. A demon was essentially the personification of insomnia, or chronic exhaustion, or intense irrational jealousy. By turning a vague, terrifying physical or mental experience into an entity with a specific name, ancient people could discuss it, categorize it, and mentally manage it. Suddenly, a sickness that had a name didn't seem entirely random anymore.
And just look at how Solomon actually deals with these entities in the text. It's basically an administrative interrogation. He summons them with his seal of authority, and he asks them, "Who are you? How do you harm humans? And how can you be constrained?" He doesn't battle them with swords or violence. Honestly, the Testament reads a lot more like a set of bureaucratic case files. The whole point is gathering information to domesticate fear, ultimately proving that true authority doesn't need to destroy, it simply needs to regulate.
But as we shift over to the rabbinic tradition in the Talmud, the story takes on this brilliant moral complexity. Here, Solomon actually needs the demon king, Ashmedai, to help build the temple. But Ashmedai isn't some mindless beast. He's incredibly intelligent and cunning, and he eventually steals Solomon's magic ring and literally usurps his throne, leaving Solomon to wander the earth as an anonymous beggar. It's a profound cautionary tale. It's telling us that power is incredibly fragile, and even the wisest king in the world can fall if he becomes arrogant enough to believe he has fully mastered the chaos he uses. Order is absolutely never immune to self-satisfaction. Moving right along to part three, grimoires and the written word. So as we move into medieval Europe, which, let's remember, was a time of immense social anxiety, constant war, plague, and famine, the flexible, fluid myths of the past hardened into really rigid systems of control. Now, you've probably heard the word grimoire, but did you know it actually derives from the word grammar? I love this fact because it brilliantly illustrates a core truth about medieval society. Literacy itself was incredibly rare. For the vast majority of people who couldn't read, a book written in Latin or Greek wasn't just a vessel for information. It was a potent form of intellectual and, honestly, almost supernatural authority. Writing itself was viewed as a literal power that could govern both the visible and invisible worlds. And because they viewed writing as control, these medieval grimoires organized the invisible world to look exactly like their own. The bureaucracy of hell was suddenly filled with feudal ranks like kings, dukes, and presidents. These entities were assigned very specific social functions, like wielding political influence or holding military command. But right beneath those fancy titles lay the true underlying fears of the time: rebellion, collective violence, and unchecked ambition. They were mirroring their own strict hierarchical society to create a comforting illusion of order. The logic was, if hell has a bureaucracy, well then chaos has rules.
Which brings us to part 4, wire and the number 72. This is where things take a truly ironic turn.
We hit a massive turning point here, where a noble attempt to debunk magic actually ended up writing the definitive rulebook for it. In 1563, a humanist physician named Johann Weyer was watching the horrific witch hunts tearing through Europe. Driven by a medical and deeply humane intention to save marginalized, vulnerable people from torture, he wrote a book arguing that so-called demonic possession was actually just mental illness or religious delusion. He genuinely wanted to demystify the supernatural and bring some reason to a highly terrified society. To prove his point, and to completely mock the absurdity of these beliefs, Weyer included an appendix at the end of his book where he systematically listed 69 demonic entities, complete with completely ridiculous royal titles. He figured that by classifying them like a natural philosopher classifying plants, he would strip them of their scary mystery. But history is full of dark, incredible irony. Instead of reading his carefully reasoned medical arguments, people just read the list. Because books carried that inherent authority we talked about earlier, people took his appendix entirely seriously. They used his satirical, joking list of 69 entities as a literal reference source for their deepest fears. No way he saw that coming. And it gets better. By the 17th century, occultists who were compiling texts like the famous Ars Goetia took Weyer's list and modified it. They added and reorganized entries until they hit the number 72. Why exactly 72? Well, because to the early modern mind, 72 just felt complete. It aligns perfectly with astronomical cycles, with sacred geometry, and with the 72 names of God in mystical traditions. It wasn't some new historical discovery, it was basically an act of intellectual aesthetics to make the whole system feel perfectly balanced and entirely closed.
Finally, part 5, mirrors of human fear. Let's look closely at the Ars Goetia. Let's bring this whole narrative to its philosophical climax and examine what this fixed list of 72 demons actually means for humanity. So the crucial point is that when you strip away all the occult trappings, you clearly see the true faces of the Ars Goetia. These entities didn't represent literal monsters waiting in the dark to get you. They represented unchecked political power, the contagious spread of collective violence, deeply held suspicions and betrayal, boundless greed, and absolute psychological despair. They were exact living metaphors for early modern Europe's very real social and political traumas, the deep anxieties of a society constantly teetering on the edge of war and collapse.
And honestly, this perfectly explains the absolute obsession with sigils. In these texts, a sigil is not a magic spell in the folk fairy tale sense. It is a graphic language of authority. Think of it more like modern law or bureaucratic paperwork. A royal seal validates a document, right? Well, a sigil was used to confine infinite, paralyzing chaos into a manageable boundary. By giving a conceptual fear a specific shape and a tangible border drawn on paper, it suddenly became something a human being could hold, copy, and, theoretically at least, control.
I really want to highlight this profound quote directly from our source material. Just as maps do not erase deserts, sigils do not erase fear. They merely make fear less boundless. That is incredibly poetic, isn't it? And it highlights a deeply modern anxiety. Over the centuries, we shifted from the moral humility we saw in the rabbinic traditions, where you accept that power is dangerous and fragile, to a highly technical illusion of control. We started believing that if we just have the right paperwork, the right list, or the right symbol, we can somehow master the unknown. So, to summarize everything we've looked at today in this explainer, the 72 demons do not tell a story about hell. They tell a story about humanity. They reflect our enduring, desperate need to structure, to categorize, and to survive the unknown. Because when the world moves faster than our understanding, we don't just sit there in the void. We fill it.
We fill it with language, with categories, and with symbols. We did it with grimoires centuries ago, and let's be real, we do it with data and endless categorization today.
And that leaves us with a thought to carry forward. When you look at the anxieties of our own modern world, the things today that feel entirely out of our control, which fear would you try to contain in a sigil? Think about it, and definitely let us know your thoughts. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the structures around you.